Well, January 27th was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And this year's commemoration marked 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. Only 56 survivors of the camp gathered this time, down from 200 just 5 years ago. This year's memorial will probably be the last major gathering of those who lived to tell their story. As the last of these eyewitnesses begin to pass away, it becomes then increasingly important that we continue to remember them and those who did not survive. That we remember that this terrible thing really happened exactly as we have been told. That we remember how this happened and consider how to keep it from happening again. This is especially important because anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and discrimination are on the rise again, right here in Canada and across the Western world. Police forces across our country have seen an unprecedented rise in hate crimes over just the last few years. Not just against Jewish people, but other minorities, including Muslims and LGBTQ persons. And this message will focus on attitudes towards the Jewish people, because that is the issue that Paul is dealing with in Romans 9 to 11. But as we do, it's important to remember that discrimination against Jewish people has almost always been connected to other forms of hatred. The 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust were accompanied by millions of others: Roma, or often called gypsies, Slavic peoples, Jehovah's Witnesses, disabled persons, Freemasons, communists, and gay people, as well as many political and religious opponents of the Nazis. One form of discrimination is usually bound up with others. And discrimination is bound up with the issues of privilege, arrogance, and resentment that are issues that we have been dealing with, that Paul has been dealing with here in Romans. Early in the letter, we heard Paul deal with a sense of privilege and feelings of resentment held by some of the Jewish Christians in Rome. In Romans 9 to 11, we see Paul turn the page and deal with the sense of privilege and attitude of superiority some Gentile Christians held against their Jewish Christian siblings, and, as we'll see, Jewish people in general. This whole section of the letter, but especially Romans 11, was given as a challenge not only to the Gentile Christians in Rome, but for every generation of Gentile Christians to treat Jewish people with respect, both those who follow Jesus and those who do not. It's a powerful message, yet one that has often been overlooked, forgotten, or simply misinterpreted. So before we dig into chapter 11 again, let's quickly review how we got here. Paul wrote his letter to the Christian community in the city of Rome. This was, again, a cluster of around 5 house churches made up of both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. That is, Romans, Greeks, and others. The church in Rome, however, had been founded and led by the Jewish Christians. That is, until the Jews of Rome were kicked out of the city by the Emperor Claudius in 49 AD. 5 years later, Claudius dies. The Jews can return to the city and to the Roman churches. Now, the challenge is that this is where most of the immediate difficulties in Romans comes from. The Jewish Christians returned to find that the number of Gentile Christians had grown significantly in their absence. Now, if this was the only thing that had changed, it would have been a good thing. That was the goal of the mission. The hard part was these Gentile Christians now did things quite differently from before and didn't want to go back to the way things had been. The first part of the letter dealt with the sense of religious privilege held by some of the Jewish Christians and their resentment over the fact that they were no longer the respected leaders of the church they had founded. Yet as we see here in Romans 9 to 11, those Jewish Christians had some legitimate grievances against their Gentile Christian brothers and sisters. Privilege and the sense of superiority can go multiple directions. And in most ways, Gentile privilege was the stronger and more serious of the two. This should be obvious from the fact that Rome's Jews could be deported at any time on the whim of the emperor. The emperor just had to decide they needed to go. Some Jewish people might have felt a sense of religious superiority, but in many ways this was compensating for how vulnerable they were as a minority group in Rome and its empire. Because while, again, Gentile Christians have our own dark history of anti-Semitism, it didn't start with us. Anti-Semitic attitudes were very well established among many Greeks and Romans centuries before Jesus. While some Gentiles respected Jewish people for their strong sense of ethics, some even converted, many others condemned Jewish customs as antisocial and considered their rejection of other gods to be strange and downright dangerous. Things could get better or worse from year to year and emperor to emperor, but the social and political status of Jews in Rome was always lower and much less secure than those of their Gentile neighbors and Gentile Christian brothers and sisters. This made it especially difficult when the returning Jewish Christians found that some of their Gentile Christian siblings no longer respected them in the same way and were critical of their approach to following Jesus. Some of this may have been affected by Roman prejudices. This is a guess since Paul doesn't explicitly address it. But what Paul does very clearly address is the fact that some of the Gentile Christians have seriously misunderstood what the gospel has to say about God's relationship to the Jewish people and their place in God's plan of salvation. This misunderstanding is rooted in the difficult facts that a majority of Jewish people had not accepted Jesus as God's Messiah. This becomes especially troubling if we follow Paul in saying that a right relationship with God depends on faith, particularly faith in Jesus, rather than obeying the commandments and the law of Moses. So Paul begins by sharing how troubling this is to him personally as a Jewish Christian. Paul at the start of chapter 9 says, "I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my own people. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, comes the Messiah." The whole of Romans 9 to 11 is about this one issue, making sense of why so many Jewish people had not at that point accepted Jesus. Paul spends chapters 9 and 10 reflecting on the story of Israel in the Old Testament and the mysterious and surprising way that some people would be chosen and respond to God's calling and yet others turn away. Then at the start of our reading from chapter 11, Paul addresses the issue head on. "I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew." Paul is very clear on this. God has not rejected the Jewish people. As we heard in the reading, and we'll hear again in a moment, Paul says this twice for emphasis. He also says it twice because there are two reasons why to him it is clear that God has not rejected his people. The first is the existence of all the people just like Paul, Jewish Christians, Jewish followers of Jesus. Again, this is something that really, really needs to be underlined. All of the apostles, all of the writers of the New Testament, all of them were Jewish. And as much as it might seem obvious, it's important to remind ourselves constantly that Jesus was Jewish. I have lost track of how many times, from when I was very young, I had to remind various kinds of Christians this simple fact. I remember correcting a teacher I had, and who was a practicing Roman Catholic. It shocked me that she hadn't made this connection. Yet so many Christians have not. The amnesia and erasure of the Jewish identity of Jesus and the apostles by Gentile Christians, however, is something that Paul foresaw 2,000 years ago. And he deals with it here. Paul says Jewish Christians like him represent the faithful remnant that plays such an important part in the story of God's people. The majority might go astray again and again, but God always preserves a faithful minority. The remnant proves that God's word didn't fail and does not fail, and that he will never give up on his chosen people. God is faithful even when we are faithless, and his grace keeps some faithful even in the most troubling and difficult times. So that covers Jewish Christians. What about the majority of Jewish people who have not accepted Jesus? Well, Paul answers in this way. So I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means. But through their stumbling, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their stumbling means riches for the world, and if their defeat means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Paul is saying here that one reason so many Jewish people rejected Jesus was to motivate missionaries like him to spread the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, to the Gentiles. Jesus in the Old Testament itself stressed that God's ultimate goal in calling Israel to be his chosen people was to save all people, all nations. Yet we know that basic human impulse to look after our own first. And then if there's enough left over, we'll go to other people. But because many Israelites did not receive the good news about Jesus, Jewish missionaries like Paul had no choice but to move outward to the Gentiles. This might seem surprising, but Paul has spent all of chapters 9 and 10 describing the surprising and mysterious way that God's plan of salvation has gone. It is always surprising, always full of mysteries, all the way up to the shocking death and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. Paul then goes on to express his hope that one day, every faithful, every genuine Israelite will recognize that Jesus is the Messiah and be fully included. Paul's message of hope is that, in part, the news of so many Gentiles accepting Israel's Messiah and worshiping their God will lead more Jewish people to accept Jesus as well. But Paul has a bigger hope. He doesn't put his hope on his mission. He puts his hope on God and trusts God's faithfulness to his people. That God keeps his word and God keeps his promise. Paul's hope is that at the end of history, when Christ comes again, all of Israel will recognize Jesus and the promise of the gospel will be fulfilled. He says, I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. For God's gifts and God's call are irrevocable. They cannot be taken away. God keeps his promises. I would love to go more into this, but our focus needs to be on the practical implication of this for Gentile Christians. Paul does this by way of extended metaphor we heard of the olive tree. He makes it very clear that this discussion isn't just for his own benefit or for the benefit of Jewish Christians in the Roman church who feel the way he does. His remarks are directed right to the Gentile Christians who think they are superior to the Jewish people. That they alone are now God's people, and the Jews are no longer God's people. Paul says, I'm talking to you Gentiles. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. They were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but tremble. If God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Part of the problem in the Roman church is that some of the Gentile Christians think that God has rejected the Jewish people. That the story of the Jewish people is somehow one of failure. And that the new and growing Gentile church has replaced them as God's chosen people. Living where and when we do, we can see the terrible implications of this mistaken line of thinking. These attitudes that Paul is confronting here so easily lead to contempt for the Jewish people, especially for non-Christian Jews, but also for Jewish Christians in the community who are looked down as being part of something that is now past. from that perspective, as people who need to get on board with a new Gentile way of following Jesus. The idea that the Gentile church has somehow replaced Israel in God's plan is called supersessionism. If you ever run into formal theology, that's what it's called. And many churches, theologians, and biblical scholars have spent the last 80 years unlearning this mistaken and dangerous belief. We wouldn't have had to do this if more Gentile Christians had actually listened to what Paul said 2,000 years ago. Things could have been so very different. Yet the good news is that we have a God who is always giving second chances. A God who doesn't give up on the people he has loved and chosen, even when they make terrible mistakes. God is always true to his word. God is faithful even when we are not. God always keeps his promises. And Paul reminds us here that this is a very good thing. If God could somehow give up on the Jewish people, then we Gentiles should be very afraid. Because that means he could give up on us too. And this is something that should especially shake us as Christians here in the West, where the church continues to shrink at a steady pace. The idea that God could give up on anyone should frighten us. Yet Paul's intention isn't to make Gentile Christians afraid. His goal is to make us humble and to treat our Jewish sisters and brothers with love and respect. The good news that Paul says after this is God does not give up on anyone. The good news is that even branches that seem like they have been broken off can be grafted back in. The good news is that God's mysterious plan to save the world is always so much bigger and so much more generous than we can possibly imagine. And all of this comes back to what Paul said at the beginning of Romans. I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it's written. The one who is righteous will live by faith. The gospel is for both Jews and Gentiles, and it is good news to everyone. So where do we go from here? Well, in addition to remembering the real truth of the gospel, which is again so important, but it also begins with relationships, because Paul is ultimately trying to heal and cultivate relationships in this letter to the Romans. This has been, again, relationships matter so much. Some of you will know, most of you will know my dad is also a Presbyterian minister. One of the other ministry students in his class at Knox College was a Messianic Jew named Ben. Now, if you're not familiar with them, Messianic Jews are Jewish people today who follow Jesus. They are Christians, and yet also follow the Torah and many of the other traditions kept by the majority of religious Jews. My dad became friends with Ben during their time in seminary, and they've kept touch over the years, and really gained a deeper understanding of the Jewish roots of the Christian faith through him. For this and other reasons, I was raised to be respectful and considerate towards all Jewish people. And I think this opened the door to what turned out to be one of the most important friendships of my life when I was in high school. My friend Simon, one of my two best friends in this world, is Jewish. In his case, just plain Jewish. He grew up going to a mainstream synagogue right in this region. And it was through him that I realized that anti-Semitism didn't just shrivel up following the Holocaust. It's still here. It's always been here, underneath. He was bullied as a kid simply because he was Jewish. Again, right here in this area in the 1980s and 1990s. But it's become more serious today. The Hebrew school where he sends his children has to pay for security as people protest the actions of an Israeli government he has no connections to. And then there are the others who post and paint anti-Semitic messages around near his neighborhood. And some fire bullets into other Jewish schools in various places across this country. I never really worry about violence taking my children. One of my two best friends in the world has to do that. He has every reason to be afraid. And that is not right. And what makes it so concerning is that this current rise in anti-Semitism isn't just limited to one end of the political spectrum. It's not just limited to the far right, who we tend to associate with anti-Semitism. One of the challenges is the never-ending and deeply troubling situation in Israel-Palestine, and especially the war in Gaza, has stoked anti-Jewish sentiment among some of the political left as well. And don't get me wrong, I'm deeply conflicted by the actions of the current Israeli government in the war. And I've known more than a few Palestinians. I mean, some of them have been members of our St. Andrew's family here over the years. But Canadian Jews should not have to live in fear because of some people's outrage towards the Israeli government, any more than Palestinian Canadians or Arab Canadians or Muslim Canadians should live in fear because of what Hamas has done. So all of this should remind us that anti-Semitism and other forms of fear, resentment, discrimination, and hatred are never as far away as we think. And no one is immune. And again, these things are so deeply rooted in our culture. And they pop up whenever we take our eye off the ball, even for a little while. And so, again, we must hold fast to the real truth of the gospel and remind people what the real truth is. That it's for everyone, that it calls on us to love every single human being as we love ourselves. But we also must make that love real by making the effort to have genuine relationships with people different than ourselves. And I mean, here in Hamilton, we have all kinds of wonderful opportunities. Hamilton is one of the oldest historic Jewish populations in this part of Ontario. And among many other communities, including so many people from across the Middle East. We can support both. We can be friends. We can show the love of Christ in a variety of ways and help our neighbors to feel safe and to feel loved. One relationship, one conversation at a time. And that is one thing the gospel can also empower us to do. And so I thank God for that.